Welcome, I'm Andrea Fiorillo, Head of Research and Reader Services at the Reading Public Library. Tonight's discussion is part of our series, The Vote, Exploring Voting Rights in the US, sponsored by a grant from Massachusetts Humanities. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was the outcome of a generations-long battle to gain federal voting rights for women. We're also using the centennial to examine who else is lacking representation and enfranchisement now and historically. You're invited to delve deeper into this series with upcoming programs like Black Women's Suffrage and the Long Struggle for Voting Rights, and a discussion and viewing of Chisholm 72, Unbought and Unbossed with director Shola Lynch. I'm gonna put both of those events, their dates and their registrations up in the chat boxes so that you'll be able to just click on them and register for them tonight. The Votes Project Scholar, Paula Austin, will facilitate both of those events as well as tonight's presentation. Austin is Assistant Professor of History and African American Studies at Boston University and is consulted throughout this grant. She's the author of Coming of Age in Jim Crow, DC, Navigating the Politics of Everyday Life. I'm about halfway through. Pick up a copy at the library. Professor Austin is joined tonight by Lauren Santangelo, a historian, teacher, and the author of Suffrage and the City, New York Women Battle for the Ballot. Very clever title, also available at the library. They are a lecturer in the writing program at Princeton University and are developing a digital humanities suffrage project, mappingsuffrage.com, which I will also put up in the chat box. So if you want to explore that, you can. Santangelo's most recent research, supported by an NEH fellowship from the New York Historical Society, examines the experiences and resilience of young Italian-American survivors of sexual assault in the 1920s. Please welcome tonight's guests.
Thank you, Andrea.
And Paula, you can go ahead and share away.
Okay, I will share my screen. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And a very special thank you to Lauren Santangelo for joining me. Full disclosure, Lauren and I are friends. We kind of went to grad school together. Lauren was ahead of me, just to be clear.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm really excited just we've not done this before.
Yeah.
We've not chatted about your book, about...
well, not officially.
No, we've not chatted officially. So I am very excited for us to be doing this tonight. So my first question, are we just going to get right into it, chop it up?
Sure. I mean, I would like to thank you for having me and for inviting me and for the library for having me. I am looking forward to this. You and I have had lots of conversations over the years, but not always in front of an audience. So, so I'm excited to think about our works in dialogue together.
Probably never in front of an audience, unless my cat counts. Okay, so yes, let's get started. So yes, I was holding up a copy of your book, and so it's here on the screen there on the left. And so I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about, to tell us a little bit about the book, and if there are any particular archival sources that really stand out. I know you've got some stories for us tonight, which I'm super excited to hear. But yes, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of tell us a little bit about what the book's about.
Thanks. So the book, as you know, is about the relationship, at its broadest, it explores how various suffrage organizations like the National American Women Suffrage Association, the Women's Suffrage Party, the Women's Political Union, organizations led primarily by white, middle-class, college-educated women, approached the urban landscape of New York City from 1870 to 1917. It's at its most, it's kind of its broadest. I think what's helpful for me is to kind of explain a little bit about the motivation for it. So there's a puzzle at the heart of the book project, the book, And that has to do with New York State's position in the timeline of states changing their constitution to eliminate gender as a criteria for voting. And I say that deliberately rather than enfranchising women, because gender, of course, is only one factor that determined access to the ballot, race, literacy, ethnicity, citizenship also being critical as well. So I said that deliberately. So the question for me is, the Constitution in New York State isn't changed till 1917, which is only 3 years before the 19th Amendment, and several decades after some of the earliest states, which 1890, several in 1890s, and several more in the early 1910s. So it's late in that kind of overarching timeline. Which is curious to me. And like the second part of the puzzle is like, well, we would think New York City would have all of these resources, right? Like it would have publishing potential. It has the newspapers. It has the film industry prior to World War I. It has the financial industry. So we would think there would be all of these resources that could be leveraged for organizations, but it's very late in, again, that timeline. So that was the question for me, like, what explains this? Like, how can we make sense of this? And so what I argue in the book and what I trace in the book is that the leaders I examine had to kind of learn to read the city as a text with layers of meaning and pockets of influence and navigate its gendered, racial, and class geographies. They had to ultimately demand a right to the city, which I suggest in the book. I think they do around by 1915, but then they have to do so in a way that's palatable to the electorate that they have to convince. And there's actually a polio epidemic in 1916 in New York City, and World War I that leads some activists to kind of reconceptualize their approach. So that is kind of at its like general outlines. I'd love to talk about the fire insurance map you have up there, if that's cool with you. So I think everyone can see that screen. Yes. That is a, yeah, thank you. That's the fire insurance map. And that's one of, so you asked me what was like a key archival source that kind of opened things up for me. And I think was partly these, which it's not a great image in terms of the resolution. The New York Public Library has a lot of them, high quality ones in terms of resolution. But what you see there is basically part of New York City, a plate of New York City, and the different colors represent different building materials. And these are kind of produced pretty regularly by a few different companies. And the building materials aren't really important to me. What's important to me is it gives me a sense at the street level of what's around a given address, and what is within like walking distance of an area. So it tells me, for instance, if there's department stores nearby, or if there are churches nearby, or schools, or parks, and it allows me to place an address onto a map and figure out what's around it. Now, this was really important to me because it allowed me to pursue a spatial approach to understanding organizing. It allowed me to be like, oh, we have all of these events listed in the back of the Women Voter just with street addresses, but those don't mean anything to me a century afterwards. 505 Fifth Avenue might be where the National American Women Suffrage Association headquarters is, but like, okay, I know what Fifth Avenue is, but like where exactly, what are we talking about? So these maps allowed me to kind of scale down and think about spatial tactics and spatial approaches and spatial decision making. So they were kind of really important for me in encouraging me to pursue a methodology that foregrounds the built environment. That, if you don't mind, I'll plug that last slide down there. The mapping suffrage, which you have seen evolve over the years. So if you go to mappingsuffrage.com, I've actually modeled on a site called Digital Harlem. I've done something similar and tried to build a database of events mentioned in a couple different suffrage publications, and then allow you to kind of search based on different criteria you're interested in, like where did suffrage where did the Women's Suffrage Party meet for nighttime open air meetings, right? And then it allows you to locate those events on a fire insurance map, and you could kind of scale down and see like what's around that given area. So that's a project I've been working on to continue thinking spatially, as well as to like encourage individuals to be in dialogue with me about the book, because that was really important. I wanted students to feel like they could pick up a piece of scholarship and have access to resources to like engage with that piece of scholarship. So that's kind of a full circle story of the project and kind of its current state, which is transforming and building the digital humanities component in supplement.
And Andrea put the in the chat, put the link for Mapping Suffrage. So yes, people should go and check that out.
Hopefully it doesn't crash.
Well, okay.
Which is always the like concern when I
guess we'll find out about that.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a test.
So, so yes, I mean, I think the spatial piece is kind of where I want us to go and talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that you do in the book and that you do for New York City is kind of try to figure out what the changes in the city over time, spatially, geographically, and what those are, and then how those intersect with essentially identities and power. So race, gender, class, for the activists that you're looking at, and then how that really informs their organizing strategies. And this is something, you know, I was thinking about this a lot from Tina Cassidy's two earlier presentations for the library, one about her book on Wilson and Woodrow Wilson and Alice Paul, and then when she did the social movements one, really talking about, you know, how we think about organizing strategies, you know, do they work, do they not work, you know, what's the best one? And I think also kind of how we look back at those and draw those forward, and then how thinking about those historically help us understand the current movements, plural, that we are living through. And I know one of the things that you do deliberately in the book is talk about a kind of multiplicity of movements, and why it's important to think of the sort of struggles and fights for further democratizing access to the franchise as kind of multiple movements. And so the slide here that folks are looking at includes the parade and parade is the word that is used on the archival source, that happened in the spring of 1914. I think it was in May, and the parade went through Boston Common. It went, you know, through Beacon Hill, and I don't know if it ends up in South End, but this is actually an image of them. They're on Dorchester, right, in that image. But we can see they're sort of flanked by so many people watching. So the spectacality of these becomes so incredibly important. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about spectacality as an organizing strategy, and the use of space, you know, why this kind of very visible and also the taking up of sort of public urban space is so important as an organizing strategy, especially for women in this particular, at this particular time. And then also I'm going to ask you to talk about the document that's on the right. So not the image, but do you have too many screens open?
No, I can't really see it. Is it the key to parade plan?
Yeah. It's the key to parade plan. But also I wanted I also put Florida Rough and Ridley on now I don't know if Florida Rough and Ridley was at this march. I know she was at the march in DC that Tina Cassidy talked about. And of course, you know, I just wanted to draw forward a couple of, you know, local folks. And of course, Florida is the daughter of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who is also a Black activist, Black suffragist. So Anyway, I will let you talk a little bit about spectacality, the use of urban space, why parades are important, etc.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for that, and mentioning the number of displays I have going. So yeah, I appreciate, I do think in the book that I try to be thoughtful about making clear that I'm talking about a slice of a much larger and diverse fight and longer fight for voting rights. And I think there's been some kind of really, what's the right kind of rigorous and thoughtful and wonderful and amazing scholarship coming out in the last year. I'm thinking of Martha Jones's work here, so I'd plug that. I also would just, I'm going to get to your question, but I appreciated the point about parade there, because that's one of the conversations that we've had in the past about like parade versus procession versus march versus protest, like what language gets used when. I at one point thought that would be a project, but I actually, even just in terms of the discourse that's used to describe the spectacles, it's kind of interesting to think about, in this one being specifically parades. So I think they all kind of work on slightly different registers. So it would be interesting to track like what gets used when and by who. Back to your question. So I thought I would talk about, well, I thought I'd talk about commercial space first, if that's cool with you. Does that work? Because I was gonna think about a little bit about how assumptions and meanings of space informed people's reactions to different strategies in the early 20th century. And I was going to give a couple examples of that to make that more concrete. So I was thinking, for instance, of like theaters. What happens in New York City, there's kind of two theatrical events that I like to contrast, because I think it really underscores like how space kind of informs assumptions, and we could problematize that. The one was in Maxine Elliott's theater. Maxine Elliott was like a relatively well-known theater, and an organization puts on a play there. I think it's a fundraising play. We're talking like 1912, maybe 1913. It's a fundraising play, but it's kind of provocative. It's kind of risque. It involves a man who's like nearly nude, at least according to newspaper reports, jumping across the stage, like leaping across the stage. Apparently the audience like reacted to this. It's just an interesting moment where like women are controlling the gaze, right? So there's like this kind of reclaiming of it, and it's kind of, we can think about it as really kind of powerful, but what's interesting is the newspapers kind of poke fun of it at it. They don't really think of it as kind of dangerous. They kind of think of it as a little kind of maybe silly. And that is always really interesting to me compared to what happens at a vaudeville house, a Hammerstein house, the Victoria Theater, around the same time period. It might have been 1912, where there's a suffrage week. So various organizations are asked to come and present and kind of put on a little bit of a performance about suffrage, and they kind of relish this opportunity to speak to a large audience. And what happens and it's going pretty well. But then I think it's the Women's Political Union begins selling votes for women's cigarettes. And this kind of destroys the whole event. The management reacts and are basically saying, like, you shouldn't be doing this. Actually, you shouldn't even be here. You should go back to Carnegie Hall. So like the space in which the action is happening is informing how kind of it's being read and known and the reaction to it. And it's being read as unladylike and unprofessional and what it shouldn't be happening. And what's always kind of like the interesting footnote to that story to me that really underscores the difference is the votes for women cigarettes actually, at least according to reports, come from a church fair. So they are at a church fair. Someone's like, oh, that would be a good fundraising idea. They don't cause any sort of situation at the church fair. But once they're kind of moved into the Hammerstein house, like it changes the meaning of it. It reinforms it. And this becomes like something that indicates that suffragists shouldn't be in this space, if that makes sense. You follow that? So that's a moment for where I think about kind of commercial spaces informing how we read, or how New Yorkers read and responded to different actions. You want me to tell the story? Should I do the public space? Want to hear about public space? Okay. So I think the book also tries to think about like different types of spaces. So commercial spaces, I spent a lot of time talking about. Also talk about public spaces. And I think do we have a photo? Yeah. So one of the stories I tell in the book, or recount in the book, is about a 1911 Wall Street protest. It's an open air protest, like you can see, it's clearly open air protest. It's not the first open air protest. They had started in like 1907 in New York City, so it's not the first one. It's also not the first one in Wall Street, like there had been a disastrous one a few years before. But in any case, three leaders, it's Pankhurst, Harriet Stanton Blatch, I believe, and Anna Howard Shaw. These three leaders, these three kind of white middle-class leaders, go down to Wall Street to hold a protest and try to convert the men in the financial district, as the picture kind of clearly indicates. And it does not go well. They are basically heckled. They are shouted over. I think the New York Times calls the crowd filled with unruly boys. And they ultimately leave, the three suffrage leaders, but not before they say, if you want to hear more, we're going to hire a hall. So kind of falling back on more traditional sheltered spaces. And then the crowd chants back, and not in like a positive, supportive way. They chant back, hire a hall, hire a hall, hire a hall, as like a way to make fun of organizers. I think to me, this really underscores the way in which public space was still incredibly gendered space, right? Like, this is the financial district and they're being chased out of it. Women politicking in the financial district, literally, they had to flee the scene. It got out of hand. The other thing that I think I like to draw out in this story is what happens immediately after, which is that these individuals then go right to the police and say they need greater police protection because they're going to return there the next week. And the police at first, I think, are a little hesitant, but ultimately the police protection increases dramatically from 1 week to the next. And I think this underscores who gets to claim police resources and state resources, and whose bodies get to claim what spaces too. These women were able to like leverage their race privileges to, I think, get state resources at this moment. There are other moments where there are even more violence, so I don't want to make it seem like there's not violent interactions, but I think it's important to think about whose bodies can be where, when.
Yeah, and actually this parade, that spring parade in 1914 in Boston, has about 800 police who are assigned to kind of make sure that everything goes okay and that there isn't too much drama.
Can I tell one more? Yeah.
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I didn't realize that you were.
Well, I was going to ask about so sort of in the trajectory that you're looking at, when does it become, I mean, there are definitely other people who are using the streets to have things that we would call parades. I mean, I'm thinking about the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the teens and early 20s, who are definitely having processions through the streets at, their local chapters. And I'm just wondering sort of when because this, despite the use of the word parade, right, it's definitely different than like what happens after World War I, for example, or World War II, like sort of when, soldiers come back and it's a celebration. This is definitely a parade that has a political, it's like part of a campaign for a political thing. So I'm wondering about like, so when does that become for suffragists, for suffrage organizers, when does the use of space in this way become so because because one of the things that you do in the book that I think is true for most urban spaces is that the relationship to the urban space really changes, that it's seen as kind of a scary thing for women to be kind of out in the street. And so not just sort of disrespectable, unrespectable, not respectable. I don't know what that word there's a version of that word I want, but people know what I mean. Not respectable. And then it becomes
mainstream.
Okay, I'll go with mainstream. So yeah, so can you say a little bit about what is this shift that happens? Is it something that happens culturally in the city? Is it a relationship with this? So what is this that suddenly makes a campaign parade like this a possibility for suffrage organizers?
I'll only answer this question if you'll let me talk about how New York City and Boston differed a little bit in the ways in which they use space.
Yes, do it.
Which one do you want to do first? Boston. I'll just do Boston and New York City fast because I think that's like
not too fast, but yeah,
okay.
Not too fast.
So yeah, I think one of the things that's also interesting, and I don't actually have language around this, I wonder if you have language, is to think about the ways in which cities kind of market or represent themselves to a larger world. And I was thinking a little bit, or like how they identify themselves. And I was thinking a little bit, I was going back through my research, and I was thinking there's a lot of times when the Waldorf Astoria is used in New York City in the 1890s as spaces for like the New York City Women Suffrage League. And that strikes me as like being a very different decision that is some way representative of how New York City might have tried to identify itself compared to events that are held in Faneuil Hall, for instance, in Boston, which then is like being explicitly referred back to as places that have this history. And Boston has historically thought of itself as a city that needs to preserve its history and recognize and celebrate its history. So I think like there's also different inflections in terms of the way
a sort of a birthplace of the revolution.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
Like even so I have the Boston celebrating I'm reading a quote, the 19th Amendment, the Woman Citizen describes hundreds of Massachusetts women marched from the Common to historic Faneuil Hall. No more fitting setting could have been found than the old historic hall, whose halls have resounded with appeals to liberty since its founding. So it's interesting to think about how kind of the spatiality of or the representations of different cities led to different ways of organizing, just in terms of how cities identified or thought of themselves. So I thought I would just bring that up because it's just interesting to me as like a comparison. Back to your
Well, and I think that makes total sense, right? That why would the organizers not make use of this reputation, this representation to make it really clear why they absolutely should be in those spaces publicly, making a claim to that history, to the rhetoric, but also to the history.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it comes up a lot, the use of Faneuil Hall in particular seems to be, and like an explicit link back, right? Explicitly making the connection. So that strikes me as kind of an interesting distinction, like New York City as this space that probably saw itself as like a commercial leader using a hotel that's kind of has a reputation for luxury and elegance. Boston organizers wanting to look back to the American Revolution. Does that make sense? Yeah. Your parade question, which was like, tell us the parades. So let's see. The first kind of unofficial parade happens in New York City in 1908. It's unofficial because they can't get a permit to march that day, so they can't technically have a parade or a procession or a march or whatever we're calling it. And then it kind of grows from there, I think what happens is that at first in like 1907, 1908, people who are taking street public action are seen as incredibly radical. They're seen as the suffragettes, who are like the militant version, the radical version. And there's individuals like Maud Malone in New York City who like proudly thinks of herself in that light. And she's one of the people that holds the first open air meeting in Madison Square Park in New Year's Eve 1907, and then helps to organize that first parade. And there's like an effort to distance from leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt for a little while, from like what is kind of seen as like potentially alienating to individuals whose votes they need, kind of women taking public action, public taking to the streets. But I think that kind of there's new generational leadership. I think that there's an increasing kind of, this becomes less and less radical almost in the more it happens. And by like the early 1910s, these have become really kind of standard tactics for the National American Women Suffrage Association and the Women's Suffrage Party, to kind of show the diversity and to show the size of their movement. I'm always really interested in like how they decided to organize the parade. Like, because sometimes it's by assembly districts, or sometimes you get assembly districts plus like professional groups plus like county groups, and they're trying clearly to make different points when they organize in different ways. So I'm like always, I can't read what this Boston one says here, like the different ways it's split up. But that's always really fascinating to me, like how they're categorizing and thinking of themselves and then showcasing that to a larger public.
Right.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
I think that what's so important about the lineup,
Yeah.
right, and the kind of way that the lineup might change,
Yeah.
is the reminder of the sort of intentionality and the very deliberate way that this, and for me as someone, so this is not my time period, right? But I teach about kind of social movements broadly, and the kind of debates that happen in social movement theory about, well, is it spontaneous? Is it organized? What's the investment in it being one or the other? And it's so important to kind of notice all of these details about how the lineup might change depending on where they are. And I think the point that you're making too about why they begin to use the streets in the way that they do is definitely about numbers, given that the campaign is about getting more numbers, right? To back them.
Yeah, I mean, Maud Malone, who is, I should say, is a librarian, that feels appropriate to point out, at the New York Public Library, makes it very clear that early on, her decision to do these open air meetings is because she's like, we're just going to talk to the same people over and over again. If we're in theaters, we're not going to reach people that actually need to be converted. So the streets give that possibility. And she's very kind of clear about that and deliberate about that. And that's why part of the Digital Humanities Project, Mapping the Suffrage Metropolis, wants to think about where do the open air meetings happen? What street corners are they on? And how does that compare to when commercial spaces are being used, or what time of day, etc. So yeah, I think those are all kind of things that could help us gain greater understanding of various organizing tactics and strategies.
So I want to ask you 5 more things, but I feel like I don't know that we fully have time for all 5 of my things. Okay, but you talked briefly. You talked about suffragists. Yeah. And suffragettes. And I feel like it's only because I know you and I knew you while you were working on this project that I now, that I hear the use of the word suffragette, and I'm like, stop, don't do that. And actually, so this comes up if anybody was at either of Tina Cassidy's talks, right? She talks a little bit about the difference. Will you also tell us the difference? And just give us a kind of basic definition, and why, are there activists who identify, American activists or US activists who identify themselves as suffragettes, or is that exclusive to?
I think it's less common, but for instance, Malone, I think there's actually a newspaper in New York City called The Suffragette at some point or something along those lines. There are certain individuals who come and to embrace the label, I think, though less common than in the UK. What I'll say is, so it's a term that I think comes up, I don't know why I have this date on the top of my head, is 1906. And it's used in Britain to kind of make fun of, by journalists to make fun of individuals taking more militant actions. And it's a way to kind of diminish it by adding the E-T-T-E to the end. And that then becomes a framework in the United States in which journalists begin to categorize individuals as suffragists versus suffragette. In the United States, the radicalism isn't as militant maybe as in Britain. So for me, I think a lot about
not a lot of property destruction is what.
Yeah. I'm like circling through my head of things. Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. So I think in the United States, it becomes almost like a taxonomy or like a heuristic device that journalists use to like group different individuals to understand the various organizations that are emerging. And it becomes about like who's using like public street space for a little while. Like if an individual like Maud Malone is using the street, that would kind of earn her a suffragette label. Whereas Carrie Chapman Catt, who is like still relying on commercial spaces for a little while, becomes a suffragist. I think these lines begin to blur a little bit in New York City, at least by the early 1910s, as there's like crossover of strategies. So to answer your question, yes, less frequently and kind of as a journalistic frame to understand what's happening around them.
Okay, and so for us, should we just be erring on the side of calling everyone a suffragist unless they identify themselves as a suffragette? Is that the best way for us to move forward and do it right?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. I'm just checking.
No, that seems right to me.
Okay. So one of the things you reference in that discussion of suffragist versus suffragette is really some internal maybe debates or disagreements about strategy that begins to happen as the movements grow. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit. I mean, we know that there is an anti-suffrage movement for sure, right? There are folks who are like, no way, we should not be doing that. And women in particular. So yes, like what's the anti-suffrage movement? And then what is the debate? But I'm less interested in the anti-suffragists, as you know. I'm more interested in the internal debates within the suffrage movement around strategies and tactics. I mean, knowing, are they all working for a national amendment? Are there these other things that they're working on that are maybe more hyper-local? So can you share a little bit about internal disagreements, maybe inter-organizational, intra-organizational, and then of course, they're all pro-suffrage versus the anti-suffragists.
Can I start large and go small? Start with like anti-suffrage versus suffrage.
Yeah, you can do
because I think that makes the most conceptual sense to me.
All right.
And I think it's probably particularly important to point out in terms of Massachusetts, which I don't know how many people are familiar, but Barbara Berenson has a book out recently on Massachusetts, and she demonstrates the kind of power of the anti-suffrage movement. Anti-suffragists certainly existed in New York. Susan Gutierrez has written a whole book on them. But I think in a lot of ways it takes root in Massachusetts. And these are a couple images that we located from the Massachusetts Historical Society. that are put out by Massachusetts anti-suffrage organizations that I think capture some of their key arguments. Paula, do you want to talk about them? You want me to talk about them? You do photographs more than I do, so I'm wondering if you want to react.
This is maybe the second time I've looked at them, but I can tell you what I see, and then you can tell me kind of how they fit into the history.
Sure, that sounds good.
So the one on the left, the one on the left looks like a very typical photograph that is kind of drawing out maybe some anti-immigrant visuals. But it looks like, unfortunately, dad has to take care of the kid because mom is a suffragist, and right, and it says Papa minds the baby. Mother is out whooping it up for her candidate, like she's at a is it a campaign party? It sounds like maybe it's a campaign party. But the carriage is like decked out in campaign sort of paraphernalia. I think it looks like it's a mayoral race.
It looks like there's not even room for the kid in the stroller.
No, I mean, is there a kid in the stroller? Is that kid who's walking supposed to be in the stroller?
I'm not sure.
We don't know. But yeah, so it says, consequently, Papa minds the baby while Mama hunts for votes, even though Papa is not equal to Mama in making baby happy. So there's a little bit of a dig there that really, and that kid maybe looks like that kid is not happy to be with dad. So yeah, that looks like maybe that's not the best way forward. And then the one on the right, the one on the right really is like trafficking in some anti-indigenous ideologies, sort of the kind of war cry, war path, right? She's got some kind of like tomahawk type thing. Right. So some of the imagery is very reminiscent of sort of the savage Indian on the war path, including the kind of, the sash is in a particular spot that to make it sort of look to kind of represent, maybe some traditional version of native dress for women, right? The hair, the feather. So all of that. And I think to the caption, her mother's voice definitely speaks to me about the kind of war cry. But it's interesting because the bringing up the concept of war in terms of thinking about a suffrage activist, right, seems like that I can imagine why anti-suffragists would use that imagery, but also that language. And then the dad seems protective of that kid. The kid seems frightened of what is outside the window. So I don't know. What am I right? Am I on the right track here?
Yeah, no, I think that's, it's interesting that both of them have like children and family at stake, right? They're kind of very different images, and they're both centering on like what suffrage will do to the home and to the family, which was one of the key anti-suffrage position. Like, is it going to lead to divorce? Who's going to watch the children? Will now women have to serve on juries? Like, what are the consequences of this? I found these images, particularly the Massachusetts Historical Society put them up, and I found them particularly kind of encapsulating of some of the key anti-suffrage positions that I think are visible. And yeah, I think you read both of those spot on, as I would read it as well. I'd say it's interesting to me that one of the differences between the two, beyond the fact that there's photographs, is that I wondered to what extent if there's like a class distinction that's being made here.
I definitely see that.
Yeah, that home is like particularly, I don't know.
We know what that wingback chair represents. There, with the pattern, we're clear.
Right.
We're clear about
and the like painting in the background. I don't know, and the curtain. So
definitely.
Yeah, cool. Sorry, I got distracted by the photographs because we like to read photographs together. And I should also say, to like bring it back to Massachusetts, to give you an example, is that Maude Wood Park, who is like a leader in suffrage organizations in Boston and for college women, she actually is married. She remarries after her first husband dies, but she keeps this very much a secret because she thinks that that will make her more palatable and she won't be accused of neglecting her husband. So Berenson and some other scholars talk about like the very few number of people that knew that she was actually married. And this to me is kind of an indication of the power of anti-suffrage to like to prevent from preventing Maude Wood Park from like having to encourage her to have to hide part of her private life because she's afraid it would be used and leveraged against her. So that's kind of just an interesting point to highlight the actions people took, I think, to navigate around.
Yeah, and they definitely could sort of, they had some power over the kind of narrative enough so that, yeah, that she would think it would not be a good idea.
Right. So you then asked me about, so I'm just trying to remember your questions. You asked me about fractures within organizations.
Yeah, and between organizations. I mean, yeah. I think I'm just interested in the diversity of approach, and maybe the diversity of goals as well. You know, is everybody working on the national amendment, or does that happen at some point, right? Is it that people are working on very local campaigns that are about, you know, constitutional amendments at the state level, and then that shifts? So I don't know, I was just sort of interested in
yeah, I mean, I think it depends who we're talking about and when we're talking about, right? And this shifts over time and over place. So in Massachusetts, so there's different layers of suffrage, right? So there's like local school suffrage that I think Massachusetts starts in 1879. Then there's municipal suffrage, and then there are the state constitutions, the federal constitution. There's presidential suffrage that happens like as a kind of partial measure in Illinois. So there's just like kind of lots of different ways into it. And I think that creates tension, like what the best approach and best strategy is.
Lauren, sorry, this is Andrea. Could you just clarify for everyone what those different levels of suffrage mean, like school committee votes and so on, please?
Yeah. So yeah, the idea that you could vote for school. This happened. So I didn't tell that story. Yeah. So like, could you vote for local officials? Could you vote for school boards? Can you vote on? I think some places you might be able to vote on taxes. So there's just like different kind of voting rights, I guess, or voting abilities. Like you could vote on different things. So I think sometimes we think of voting as like one huge thing, but actually there's like various ways in, versus like having full voting rights. So that's, I hope explains. Paula, maybe, is that okay? So I think there's tension about what the best approach is. And this tension exists. I guess I want to say a couple things. Can I step back once and say that I think, and I want to problematize this, but let me start by saying this because I think it like allows us to talk about some of the fractures. I think the National American Women Suffrage Association kind of claimed itself as the suffrage movement and the suffrage organization, right? And in a minute or did you want to?
And that was like it was a national. It has the word national in its organization, and so was the federal amendment essentially the main goal, or no? It was just an.
I think the federal amendment is the main goal, but the approaches to it changes over time, like how this should happen. But what I'd say is that within there's divisions, right? So within this organization that kind of claims itself as the mantle of suffrage, the kind of the proxy for suffrage, there are divisions within it. There's divisions even before it's created. The National American Women Suffrage Association is created because two earlier associations that had at one point been one association split, and so you get the American Women Suffrage Association and the National Women Suffrage Association. in the 1870s and 1880s, and they split over the 15th Amendment and the strategy over the 15th Amendment. The National Women Suffrage Association wants to oppose the 15th Amendment because it doesn't address gender, whereas the AWSA, which is the Boston-based Lucy Stone branch, takes the opposite approach. So like even early on there's these tensions, and then they combine again in 1890 as the National American Women Suffrage Association, and there's tensions about the strategies to like what should be focused on, what should be prioritized, and what actions are acceptable, I guess is another way. Like is picketing in front of the White House acceptable? So we end up getting another organization that emerges from the National American Women Suffrage Association, which is the Congressional Union and later the National Women's Party, that takes a very different approach to lobbying and politicking in terms of what it thinks is the best approach. And then sometimes you just get people who don't get along, right? So I'm thinking about, you know, the story Lily Devereaux Blake and Susan B. Anthony, who like, Blake thought of Anthony as a mentor for a really long time, and then all of a sudden got, not all of a sudden, that makes it seem like it was uncalled for, slowly thought she was being pushed out of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and not getting her due, and ends up creating a different organization, which kind of with some broader goals. So I think the thing that's hard is that there's not one. Like that's just looking at one organization, right? That's kind of claimed itself as the organization, and we can talk about how that happens and why that happens. But that's like the fractures within it. But then there's all these like various state and local and unaffiliated. And so what I'd say is that I also would think that we want to kind of problematize who gets to represent the suffrage movement. So for instance, the National Association of Colored Women has a suffrage division. The NAACP works for suffrage. Socialists in New York City turned down the opportunity to cooperate with the National American Women Suffrage Association, not because they don't believe in the vote. They believe in the vote. They just don't want to do it through the National American Women Suffrage Association, who they think of as this kind of capitalistic class. So that's to say, like, there are these internal struggles within the National American Women Suffrage Association, which then leads to kind of new organizations forming. But there's also, and this is, I think, the work that Martha Jones and others are doing, is kind of like really broadening out from like suffrage movements to like voting rights, and how doing so kind of changes a lot of what we think we know.
I mean, I personally love that kind of complication of what it looks like inside of movements that may have a similar goal, but are kind of, you use the word fracture, are sort of like breaking off and forming other, I mean, to me, what that says is that there is critical mass. You can't actually break off and form other things unless you kind of have critical mass in these other areas with other people who want to work with you on particular things. And I think we see this all the time as movements grow, and they sort of last for longer, that that we see shifts, we see breaking off, we see smaller groups forming and kind of taking on. And I think what we know at the end of that is that we wouldn't have the outcomes that we had if we didn't have, I mean, maybe this is not causation, but there's correlation there. Yep. that we get to the outcomes we get to, and part of that journey was all of that fracturing, was all of that breaking off and forming smaller groups or other organizations that then do a slightly different thing that maybe changes something at the political level, but maybe it changes something at the cultural level, right? We'd have to kind of go back and look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what happens with the open air meetings and Malone, right? Like that ultimately this thing that is seen as really radical and was going to hurt the movement, there's like a recognition that, so like, well, she's kind of ostracized for a while. There, it ultimately is a strategy that then becomes absorbed by the National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Women's Suffrage Party. So yeah, I certainly think that's the case.
Okay, so I want to be mindful of time. I want to be able to open it up and talk with everybody who is here with us. So I want to kind of close us out. And so you've shared with us on this slide this quote from Alice Stone Blackwell, who is a local.
Yeah. Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell's like kind of the next generation. There's a lot of like family ties within various suffrage organizations, and this is one. So yeah, I just put this up. I was doing a little bit of research because the thing, it's like I have to refresh my memory sometimes. And so I was looking at new periodicals that I hadn't looked at before, and this is one that came up and struck me as a particularly important point to make at this moment. I think also the thinking about the local as much as the national, right? Like we talked a little bit about the different levels and layers of suffrage and voting. So, well, that's not captured in the quote. I hope it's something that came out in the previous answer to one of the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, like in terms of big picture takeaways, for me, in thinking about this fight to expand voting rights ultimately, and kind of the long history of it, is how much work it continues to take, how much work it took then, how many different people with different kind of ideologies about what made the most sense, and taking different levels of risk to make this thing happen, right? To essentially expand our democracy. And I think, one of the things that the fight for suffrage at this moment does is, and then continues to do, is really a reminder that we were not on a trajectory towards, inclusivity in any particular way. And I think these fights for the expansion of access to the franchise, of democracy generally, these fights kind of tell us that we need to fight, right? That we're not going to end up there sort of, because we're not on some kind of natural progression.
And once they're there, they're not always there, right? It's something you have
right.
to like.
We have to work to keep them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Lauren Santangelo. We'd like to, Andrea, do you want to come back?
I'm coming back. Okay, so yeah, you're welcome to come on camera if you'd like to at this point. You might show up in our video, but we certainly welcome you to come on camera and ask questions. I'm wondering, just to kick it off, Paula, if you know any more about who organized the rally, the riot, the spectacle at the Boston Common and the Public Garden, and whether they were also involved later in the big march in DC.
Yeah, so the Boston Common one happens in fall of 2015, and there's
1915.
2015.
I know what you meant.
So close.
Yeah.
Okay, 1915. Yes, that's a different date. And actually, I think there's more information about the one that happens the spring before in 1914. Is that the right date? Yes. Okay. And I don't know that I know like who. I don't know that I know what organization is at the center of it. I do know it was inclusive of lots of organizations. And I don't, Lauren, do you know about either of them?
Not particular details. I do about know. I think the 1915 one, or maybe it's the 1914 one, is called the Victory Parade, which is always kind of interesting because it's overly confident in interesting ways. I have a couple notes. This is the benefit of having so many monitors up about anti-suffrage protests at it. So, I have the diversity of marchers, one banner noting the laundry workers need your help. vote yes. Teachers, a battleship costs from $4 million to $7 million. How many schools would that endow? Which is kind of an interesting rhetorical move. And that there are anti-suffragists there who release red balloons because anti-suffragist color is red, but they don't exactly float over the right spot. But that doesn't actually get at the question about who organizes that. I would
Right.
guess the Massachusetts Women Suffrage Association
Mhm.
or the Boston group. I would guess Maud Wood Park is involved, but I can't say 100%.
And there's another question in the chat from Bob, and it says suffrage had divisions on race. And I think the rest of the comment is like about including Black women, how they were excluded or included with white women's organizing. And Bob, please chime in if I interpreted that wrong.
Should I?
I'm Beverly. I'm using my husband's iPad.
Oh, Beverly, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I don't know how to fix it. Anyway, I learned from recent documentaries that Black women did not get the right to vote until 1965. And that's a long time, between 1920. So,
Beverly, I think we might have lost your audio there. I think Beverly, if you want to put something else in the chat, but maybe Paula and Lauren can kind of start talking about some of those divisions.
Okay, sure. No problem.
Oh, you're back. Or you can finish what you were saying.
Okay. My question is also, why were the Western states, what do you call it, early proponents of women's suffrage more? You would think it'd be more the established older states.
Yeah, and I know Lauren, so Lauren, I'm going to let you talk about the Western states because I know this is something you've really thought about, especially when you got to thinking about New York, right? And some of the reasons why it's quote unquote late. So yeah, will you take us through some of how to think about the Western states versus, you know, other states that, yes, you would think kind of have the backing in a particular way to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I don't want to miss the first point. So can we just make sure to circle back to it and talk about like the long actions for the vote? But in terms of the Western states, I think there's like a few reasons historians have proposed. And one of the questions that I am trying to think about in the book is inverting that and thinking about like, well, why is New York towards the end of this in terms of changing its state constitution, where a lot of historians have talked about like why Wyoming, for instance, was one of the first. And I think there's like a few general reasons that automatically come to mind of why historians have thought like a place like Wyoming was first. One, because some of them are territories before they're states, and so that's easier to change the laws within, and then when they become states, that those laws remain in place. I think that's true of Wyoming. There's also some have argued that it was an effort to attract more women to the area. That I'm trying to think, there's like a few different arguments that are made about why the West was first.
Lauren, I had always heard that it was because they wanted more influence, they wanted more representation, and that they couldn't get it without the ladies, whereas other areas had more population or different demographics.
No, I mean, that is also, I think that when I was learning this stuff, that is also the reason that I heard was the need for a voting populace, and because the population was low.
Because they were going to let women vote before the sheep and the cattle.
Yeah. So that's to say that I think historians have provided a variety of different interpretations of why like Midwestern states were among the first. I think there's also like a conservatism about the Northeast that at least existed in assumptions about strategizing, like where resources should be placed among the National American Women Suffrage Association. And there was an assumption that the Midwest was more progressive and open to new ideas and experiments, and that New England and New York was more conservative and would not be open to such things. So I think in just terms of resource allocation, those assumptions came into play too as well.
And I think too, I mean, the other part of that, Andrea, that you were talking about, I think some of that is about the culture of, you know, a Western, sort of more rural, potentially, sort of not urbanized, right? Not industrialized in particular way that kind of speaks to a maybe a kind of democratization of the type of work that people are doing, which I think like speaks to sort of the what you're calling conservatism of New England and the Northeast, specifically like a kind of cultural one that is around gender roles.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the things that historians have followed, thought about.
So I'm going to throw in one more thing before we go back to Beverly's first question. And then Jody's got a question, and I think Willie's got something lined up. And that is that Massachusetts was one of the very last to go. New York and Massachusetts both were digging in their heels, and the men representing those states really would not be convinced. So there was a stream of real pushback on that. So Beverly also kind of wanted to know about the racial makeup of suffrage, and maybe you could speak to that for a moment. And then Jody's got something in the chat, and we can either read from that, or you can do it live, Jody.
If it's okay, I would like to kind of talk about this through the 1913 Washington D.C. March, if that's okay. Let's use that as kind of a concrete example of the racism of many of the leaders of the National American Women Suffrage Association. So there's a parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. And African American women are asked to not march with their contingents, but to march in the back of the procession. So it's a clear example of like racism within the movement. I also think what is really worth telling too is the effort to resist that and to contest that. So Ida B. Wells, for instance, jumps out of the crowd, maybe? I think she's in the crowd. And when her contingent, which is I think the Illinois contingent, walks by, she joins the procession. So I think there is certainly racism and defenses of white supremacy among leaders of the National American Women Suffrage Association, as well as actions to contest that. So I think both of those are equally important to underscore. Black women like contesting those and putting their bodies on the line to do so.
Yeah, and Wells said, I mean, the plan really was that she was going to march with her contingent, her state contingent. I mean, she had the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was, I mean, yes, so NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women had kind of suffrage auxiliaries. I hate that word, but I think I said it right. Yeah. For those organizations, but Wells had started like a fully suffrage organization. And so the plan really was that she was going to march with that. And then once they got there, there was this sort of rule. But yes, she absolutely breaks it. I mean, all of these Black women sororities also are kind of in full show. I think what's so interesting to me about thinking about the kind of long struggle for voting rights, to your point, Lauren, and the ways in which kind of not everyone is able to access the franchise, right? I mean, from the 15th and then to the 19th. And then we get the voting rights, 1965. I think what's interesting is when I think about Black women organizing and voting rights being one of those things, I think that's the thing I think that's why we don't get a lot about what Black women organizing around suffrage looked like. And I think that is one of the things that the new Martha Jones book, Vanguard, does like really, really well. is looking at them as being at the forefront, but their organizing was so multi-issue, and that voting rights was so much part of a number of other campaigns and fronts that they were fighting on, anti-lynching, et cetera. So I think that's that. I mean, I don't know if that's, you know, I don't know if that's our fault as historians in terms of like what we have prioritized and the stories that we've wanted to tell, or if that's about the sources. But I think that's one of the interventions, I think, from the new Jones book, is to kind of remind us about the multiplicity of issues, but then to focus on the expansion of the franchise.
Yeah. And I mean, this would be an opportunity, one of the kind of most compelling books, Anne Moody's memoir, right? If anyone is looking to like
Coming of Age in
Mississippi.
Mississippi.
Thank you. Yeah.
By Anne
to think
Moody,
about voting rights in the early 1960s, I guess.
So Jody had a question, and she says, wondering how our guests react to what seems like a trend against feminism. I have personally observed that many young women do not want to call themselves feminists. It's lost its cool or maybe become a bad word, even if women have gained and would like to hold on to so many rights. I guess my question is really, where are we now and what has been gained and still needs to be worked for?
I mean, I guess become a bad word again. I don't know how many people have watched the Mrs. America limited series, but it was a bad word, and then it sort of became bad word again. Although I feel, so here's the other thing, I think, and I don't know, maybe Jody, that you can comment more on this, but I mean, here's the thing that I noticed with my students, and maybe like over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or so, a bad word, but not because they're like afraid. I think there are those students who are afraid, right, to identify as such, and that they will somehow be thought of in a particular way, in kind of that old Mrs. America way. But there also seems to be younger women who are talking about concerns that the ideologies at the heart of this feminism is not a kind of intersectional understanding of sort of the multiplicity of identities, the way they overlap, and then how they intersect with power and oppression, and the concern about that definition of feminism. Although, you know, I mean, I often tell them that those early definitions of feminism, for some, were absolutely intersectional in the ways that people were acting, but also the kind of ways that they were organizing and the conversations that they were having, and that those activists, right, in the late 1970s, for example, would absolutely say it's not feminism unless it's intersectional, right? So they wouldn't even call feminism if it were not, right, this kind of multiple understanding about the intersections. I don't know, Lauren, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would similarly agree with you that I don't know that I don't know that I agree that people think it's lost its cool. I feel like students are maybe more willing to call themselves feminists, but also push up against what that means, right? To not accept the limitations of what's been handed down, but to like question and problematize and think deeply, which seems to me a shift from, I don't know, a decade ago or 2 decades ago, where I do think I would get more resistance if I asked who was a feminist. Is that kind of I mean, we've been in the classroom together for a while.
Yeah, Jody, do you want to say more?
Well, I just want to, I guess, just go on to ask, you know, where are we now in terms of women's not just right to vote, but rights in general? I mean, what do you think we need to be moving towards? What should be our goals for the future? And what are we thinking about? What should we be thinking about?
I mean, I think one of the things that's been so interesting is this pushback to the politics of respectability, the real organizing that's happening around rape culture on college campuses across the country. And so I do think that, you know, so for me, even if those young women are not identifying as feminists, I sort of don't totally care if, right, because it does feel like they are attempting to address not just political access, but also these shifts in kind of long-standing entrenched cultures that are, you know, heteronormative, patriarchal. And so I feel like those kind of cultural pushbacks, you know, are eventually going to have their kind of political outcomes. I mean, and you know, I don't know how people, like, which comes first, cultural change or political change. And this is always a debate that we have in the classroom. And I don't know where I land day to day, but I do think cultural change is so incredibly important, and we've seen so much of it. The political then outcomes seem longer, like take longer, because that's about who's in those positions, right? So all of these young people who are organizing and making cultural change, right? Will they be able to push people in those politically powerful positions? Do we have to wait for these young people to be in those positions, right? So, I mean, I think that's always the question for me, but I think cultural change is so important. And even if we don't see the impact at the political level, something is happening. And as historians, right, we look back and see that thing happening, and then we can look at the contemporary moment and talk about the political change that happened as a result. But that's all hindsight, right? But I think it makes me like kind of hopeful for cultural change that I am part of happening now, to make an assumption that it's going to work in the way that I've seen the history work.
Yeah,
and
I
I'm
mean,
generally not hopeful. I'm just going to be honest.
it's true. I can vouch for that. Yeah. I mean, I will just say that one of the, like, this is, I think Paula is exactly right. But I'll just plug one of the books that I read most recently that was kind of really powerful for me to think about feminism. And that was Sarah Ahmed's work. What is the name of it? Do you remember the title of the book?
Well, my favorite,
I know
my
we have
favorite
different
piece is
favorite.
she's got the history of happiness, which is my favorite.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but living a feminist life.
Yeah, which talks a lot about being a feminist and embracing an inner feminist killjoy, and recognizing that naming a problem is not actually creating a problem, which for me was like super helpful, empowering reminders that I think I needed at this particular moment. But that's more about kind of my own relationship to feminism, and a plug for a book that I just keep talking about.
Thank you.
I'd like to put one more plug in for a book on sort of the state of feminism before we move on to Willie's question that I think he's going to ask live, and that is, I think it's Rebecca Solnit. She has a lot of essay collections, and I think she has one. I think it's The Men Explain Things to Me, but I might be confusing it with Hope in the Dark, which is more disaster related. But she has this brilliant essay on feminism and why, you know, how we can feel like we haven't gotten anywhere, but in actuality, things like domestic violence, which used to not really be considered a crime or prosecuted or taken seriously in any way, now are very much seen as a crime. And even though we don't always get the justice we want in these cases, we at least know that we can call the police and will be taken semi-seriously, and that a judge might take it seriously, and the outcomes might be a little bit different, like it's seen in a very different light. So anyway, and she does talk about rape culture and a lot of where we were and where we are, and that we have a long road to hope, but also like lots of reason for hope. So with that plug, Willie, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. And first, I wanted to thank Lauren and Paula for what they've taught me this evening and for sharing their time, and especially to thank the Reading Public Library for these great programs. I think that this is the fourth one in this series I participated in, and I've learned a lot. Both Lauren and Paula used some terms that I found interesting, or some ways of thinking, when Lauren was speaking about space, and then Paula used the term hyperlocal that caught my attention. And I guess my question kind of drills down a little bit more on Beverly's question from earlier. You know, in the 1900s, Boston and New York were even more segregated cities than they are today. You know, each had Irish and Italian areas, each had the so-called Chinatown and other types of stratification, including really strong socioeconomic stratification. And so if we look to voting rights support by neighborhood, I find myself wondering if there is a reflection sort of in a neighborhood by neighborhood area, thinking about nationality and socioeconomic factors that might have been at play in which women came out and spoke in favor in March. I couldn't help but notice in most of the pictures I've seen, the women marching look rather well-heeled. Not that I'm an expert on fashion in the early 1900s, but I do find the voices of women in these different stratified nationalities, and especially women who are probably coming from poor areas, are not as well represented in what we're talking about, and would welcome any comments that either of you have there.
Did you want to go? I was looking for my unmute button, but I can go first, or you could go first.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, I know because I know that you looked at strategies around trying to include women from kind of outside of middle and upper class communities.
Yeah, so I mean, I have a few things to say. I'm trying to organize my thoughts, and this is not actually my language, and I forget whose language it is, but it's was really compelling language to me, thinking about industrial laborers organizing and being involved in suffrage despite all of the other things that are happening. So it's not that they're not there, they are there. They're just, it's like, it's a despite thing. It's like an addition to thing, which I thought was really, I'm not conveying it as clearly as, do you remember who said that, Paula? No, I thought it was really powerful to think about. So yeah, I think that there are tensions around class. There's tensions around racism. There's tensions around nativism within the movement. There are also efforts to transcend divisions within various movements, and this is where it gets super complicated. So I could talk about a few efforts to be inclusive by various organizations, if that's helpful. There is Lavinia Dock, for instance, is a nurse at the Henry Street Settlement in New York City. And she is kind of known for thoughtfully approaching individuals in the Lower East Side about the vote. At one point, she realizes that the suffrage color is orange or yellow. That's the color of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she realizes that the yellow might be being read as orange, and that might be offending Irish Catholic Protestant or Irish Catholic individuals in the Lower East Side. So she changes it to green. So like that's a moment of like being thoughtful, I think, about, and there's apparently it like gets a pretty positive reception, but at the same time we're getting those sorts of moves. We're also getting moves where leaders are putting out and saying to journalists, like, this isn't, they're like, this is public knowledge that enfranchising, changing the Constitution will improve the quality of the vote. In terms of the number of immigrant voters versus native-born voters. So like there's like super nativist and racist arguments are happening, and xenophobic arguments are happening. At the same time, there are efforts to combat that, and efforts by, I'm thinking of, I'll tell one short story if I could recall it from my head, the back of my head. There's one moment where I think she's a union organizer, suffrage organizer, is in the state legislature at in Albany, giving a speech, and basically she says, like, all of you anti-suffragists think like chivalry is here and all we need is chivalry and things are great, and then she says, but we ride the subway, we know that's not true. So there's this moment of like using her everyday experience to contest normative assumptions about gender and to challenge those. So kind of that's a three-part. I'd like to like talk about the exclusions that exist, the efforts to transcend those exclusions, as well as the efforts by in this case, a working class individual to combat those, like underscore the agency in doing so, I think would be the three kind of points I made. Paul, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, and I'm thinking specifically of the parade that happens in Boston in 1914 and the kind of levels of the, how they line up. And there is a contingent, I mean, because I think one of the things I'm thinking about is the levels of class that are, because I think we think about sort of elites and working class, but I think in the early 20th century, there's like that new emerging kind of middle section of sort of professional women in this new kind of white collar work. And so there is a contingent in that spring parade. So there are definitely, those like elite women who are up front in that first contingent. And then they're kind of the self-supporting women who are behind it. But those are like nurses and teachers and, the people in clerical positions. But behind them, I mean, what's interesting is behind them are the kind of men's clubs. They are BU faculty is behind them. So, and from the newspaper reports, what I haven't seen is the kind of people we would think about as working class women, right? I mean, are the factory women in the contingent. And I don't know that I have evidence of that for the spring Boston parade.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that sometimes happens is in New York City is thinking about the timing and the day of the parades to make it as inclusive as possible. But that's why it's like another instance of one of those, like those really small details that we could like easily glance over, like taking a second and pausing and being like, oh, this actually tells us something about assumptions being made about audience and who's going to be there. So I think sometimes that does happen. In New York City, there's a thoughtfulness and different leaders are differently inclusive, I guess what I'd say. And I think the person I was thinking of says, in spite of like having worked all day, then they're like going to organizing meetings. But yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. It was an important question, but a big question. So
It was very insightful. Thank you.
I mean, I think what's interesting, because I know, Lauren, when you were working on the book, I was sort of focused on the racial, right, the race and class piece of it, right, that these are elite and middle and upper class white women, and the kind of, the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant, the racist kind of sentiments. But I think the thing that you drew out was the ways in which that those kind of ideas about these sort of marginalized and minoritized communities at the time, that those ideas existed about, and yet there were efforts made to try to include them in the campaigns. So the sort of campaign goal,
and sometimes from the same person.
Right. No, exactly. Right, yeah. And so the campaign goal kind of won out in a particular way. And so there were these organizing strategies that were attempting to be kind of, cross ethnicity, cross class, cross racial, even while maybe, all of those assumptions about these other people continue to exist. I just think that's really interesting. And I think the thing that I most like about kind of looking at historical organizing strategies around suffrage generally, but I think around suffrage specifically, but I think around really any of the campaigns that are happening over this time is what organizing strategy looks like, because it helps us to kind of look at the contemporary movements that we're living through slightly differently, that we kind of come out, because I think we make all of these claims right now. It's like, well, does Black Lives Matter have a goal that is, or is property destruction going to alienate people, and that we shouldn't be doing that. So I think it's really interesting to, if we understand the real complexities and kind of messiness and incongruities sometimes of early movements, we might actually be able to think about the movements that we're in the middle of very, very differently.
Well, I really appreciate that, because Beverly's question about racially segregated approach, I projected on top of it this sign from Old Boston that said Irish need not apply, and wondered how that came together with this as well.
I think all of these things,
just said, Paula. Yeah,
I was just going to say all of these things like exist together, and they existed together then, and people sort of grappled with the incongruities, like as we grapple with them, in our contemporary moment.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm over here being a librarian and getting that title of the.
I'm sorry, I dropped that on you, and I
got it. No,
it's brand new. I don't even know if it's out exactly.
I'm like, I'm supposed to be moderating the questions, but instead I'm looking up books. So anyway, that's it. Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color. I just added some of the books that we've talked about tonight, because I know sometimes people want to keep reading, which we endorse at the library. Read more. Are there any other questions? And a hush fell. Okay, well, with that, I think I'm just going to say thank you so much, Lauren and Paula. It was fun to see two old friendly academics hash out their work together. And if you all have been paying attention to how hard this vote was to get, how many decades and generations it took to get it for women, and how much longer it took to get it for people of color, either officially or unofficially, and how many disenfranchised residents of America there still are. Please do not let a pandemic stand in your way, people. Do not let whatever you're hearing about the post office stand in your way. Go and vote. You have been given that right by people who fought hard for it, and there are other people fighting hard for that right. So use it. Every election, not just the big ones. And this is a big one, in case you hadn't noticed.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and remember there are those registrations for the upcoming events. So please go and take advantage of those too. All right, good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Right.